Chapter 8 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by Maynard Barber. Chapter 8. The Weaving of the Web. 10 o'clock found an eager crowd assembled in and about the large library at Fair Oaks, drawn by reports of the sensational features developed on the preceding day. The members of the household occupied nearly the same positions as on the preceding afternoon, with the exception of the secretary, who had entered the room a little in advance of the others and had seated himself near the coroner. Notwithstanding the glances of doubt and distrust which Scott encountered, and his own consciousness that suspicion against himself would deepen as all the facts in the case became known, he was as impassive as ever. Even Mr. Whitney was wholly at a loss to account for the change in the bearing of the secretary. He was no longer the employee, but carried himself with a proud independence, as though conscious of some mysterious vantage ground. On the other side of the coroner, but conveniently near Scott, was Mr. Sutherland, while in the rear, commanding a good view of both gentlemen, as well as of nearly every face in the room, sat Mr. Merrick, though to a stranger his manner would have implied the utmost indifference to the proceedings. The first witness called for by the coroner was Johnson, the butler. For the first 5 or 10 minutes his testimony was little more than a corroboration of that given by the valet on the preceding day, of the discovery of the death of Hugh Mainwaring. "You say," said the coroner, "that at Mr. Whitney's request you remained in the upper hall, near the library, and within call?" "Yes, sir." "Will you state how long a time you should think elapsed between the alarm given by Hardy and the appearance of the entire household, including both the guests and the servants?" "Well, sir, Hardy gave the alarm a little after 7. The servants were already up and crowded around there immediately, and I should say that everyone, including the ladies, was out within 20 minutes, or 30 at the latest, with the exception of Mrs. LaGrange and her son." "At what time did the latter appear?" "It must have been considerably after 8 o'clock, sir, when she came to the library in response to a message from Mr. Whitney." "And her son?" "I did not see Mr. Walter LaGrange at all during the forenoon, sir." "How was that?" inquired Dr. Westlake, rather quickly. "Was he not at Fair Oaks?" "I cannot say, sir. I did not see him until luncheon." "When did you last see Mr. Mainwaring?" "A little after 11 o'clock, night before last, Wednesday night, sir. I was in the hall as he passed upstairs to his rooms, and I heard him ask Mr. Scott to come to his library." "Did there seem to be any coldness or unpleasantness between them?" "No, sir. They both appeared the same as usual." "Did any strangers call at Fair Oaks Wednesday aside from those mentioned yesterday?" "No, sir." "Will you describe the strangers who were here, stating when they called and any particulars you are able to give?" "The man giving his name as R. Hobson called between 11 and 12, Wednesday morning. He was tall, with thin features, small dark eyes, and a very soft voice. He came in a carriage, inquired for Mrs. LaGrange, and seemed in considerable haste. He stayed about an hour. The gentleman who called about 4 in the afternoon also came in a carriage, and inquired for Mr. Mainwaring, saying he had been directed to Fair Oaks at the city offices of Mainwaring and Company. On learning that Mr. Mainwaring was out, he asked for the secretary, and I took his card to Mr. Scott, who gave directions to have him shown up into the library. I do not know when he left. He was tall, with black hair and mustache, and dark glasses." "Mr. Hobson's call occasioned considerable comment at luncheon, did it not?" "Yes, sir." "Did you observe that it had any effect on Mr. Mainwaring?" "Well, sir, I thought he appeared considerably annoyed, and after luncheon he asked me whether Mr. Hobson had inquired for him." "Did you admit Hobson when he called in the evening?" "I did not, sir. I merely met him at the door, and directed him to the south side entrance." "At Mrs. LaGrange's request?" "Yes, sir, in accordance with her instructions." "Did she give you any reason for such instructions?" "Merely that his former call had caused so much remark, she wished to receive him privately." "Was he alone when he called the second time?" "No, sir." "Can you describe the person who accompanied him?" "No, sir. The man stood so far in the shadow that I could only see the outlines of his form. I should say he was about the same height as Mr. Hobson, but considerably heavier." "Do you know at what hour they left?" "No, sir." Further questions failing to elicit any facts bearing upon the situation, the butler was dismissed, and Brown, the coachman, took his place. The latter was far less taciturn than the butler, seeming rather eager to impart some piece of information which he evidently considered of special importance. After a few preliminary questions, the coroner said, "At what time and from whom did you first hear of Mr. Mainwaring's death?" "About 7:30 yesterday morning, sir. I was a taking care of the horses, sir, when Uncle Mose, he's the gardener, sir, he comes past the stable on his way to the tool house, and he tells me that Mr. Mainwaring has been murdered in the night, right in his own rooms, and then he tells me—" "How long had you been up and at work in the stables?" "Before I heard of the murder? Well, about an hour, I should say. I generally gets up at 6. "Had you been to the house that morning?" "No, sir, but I went right up there after seeing Uncle Mose, and I was in the kitchen telling what I had seen the night before, when the butler he comes down and said as how Mr. Ralph Mainwaring wanted me, and that I had better keep my mouth shut till I was asked to tell what I knew." "Where were you last Wednesday night?" asked the coroner, rather abruptly. Brown looked surprised, but answered readily. "I was out with some friends of mine. We all went down to the city together that night and stayed out pretty late, and it seems a mighty good thing we did, too." "Why so?" asked the coroner. "Well, sir," said Brown deliberately, glad of an opportunity to tell his story and evidently determined to make the most of it, "as I said, we stayed out that night later than we meant to, and I didn't waste no time getting home after I left the depot. So when I got to Fair Oaks, I thought I'd take the shortest cut, and so I came in by the south gate, off from the side street, and took the path around the lake to get to the stables." "What lake do you mean?" interrupted the coroner. "The small lake back of the grove in the south part of the grounds." "Well, I was hurrying along through that grove, and all of a sudden I seen a man standing on the edge of the lake with his back towards me. He was very tall and wore an ulster that came nearly to his feet, and he looked so queer that I stepped out of the path and behind some big trees to watch him. I hadn't no more than done so when he stooped and picked up something and came right up the path towards me. The moon was shining, had been up about 2 hours, I should say, but his back was to the light and I couldn't see his face, nor I didn't want him to see me. After he'd got by, I stepped out to watch him and see if he went towards the house, but he didn't. He took the path I had just left and walked very fast to the south gate and went out into the side street." "In which direction did he then go?" asked the coroner. "He went up onto the main avenue and turned towards the town." "Can you describe his appearance?" "Only that he was tall and had very black hair, but his face was in the shadow, so I couldn't tell how he looked." "What did he pick up from the ground?" "I couldn't see very plain, but it looked like a small, square box done up in paper." "You did not try to call anyone?" "No, sir. The man didn't go near the house, and I didn't think much about it until Uncle Mose told me yesterday morning that the night before he seen—" "Never mind what he saw. We will let him tell his own story. Was that all you saw?" "No, sir, it wasn't," replied Brown, with a quick side glance towards Mrs. LaGrange, who occupied the same position as on the preceding day. "I was going along towards the stables, thinking about that man, and all of a sudden I noticed there was a bright light in one of the upstairs rooms. The curtains wasn't drawn, and I thought I could see whose room it was, so I walked up towards the house carefully, and I saw Mr. Mainwaring's secretary. He looked awfully pale and haggard, and was walking up and down the room kind of excited like. Just then I happened to step on the gravelled walk, and he heard me, for he started and looked kind of frightened and listened a moment, and then he stepped up quick and extinguished the light, and I was afraid he'd seen me then from the window, so I hurried off. But I thought 'twas mighty queer." "Mr. Scott was dressed, was he?" interrupted the coroner. "Yes, sir," Brown answered sullenly. "Did you go directly to your room?" "Yes, sir." "What time was this?" "I heard the clock strike 3 just after I got in." "You saw or heard nothing more?" "No, sir." "You knew nothing of what had occurred at the house until the gardener told you in the morning?" "Yes. No, sir," Brown stammered, with another glance towards Mrs. LaGrange, who was watching him closely. "What did you say?" demanded the coroner. "I said I didn't know what had happened till Uncle Mose told me," Brown answered doggedly. "That will do," said the coroner, watching the witness narrowly as he resumed his place among the servants. During the latter part of Brown's testimony, quick telegraphic glances had been exchanged between Scott and Mr. Sutherland, and 1 or 2 slips of paper, unobserved by any other than Merrick, had passed from one to the other. Scott was well aware that the statements made by the coachman had deepened suspicion against himself. He paid little attention to the crowd, however, but noted particularly